I've noticed I feel a little bit non-social. I feel kind of blah around people, like I don't know what to say, or maybe I don't want to say anything. So maybe it's good to just talk to myself so I at least have some kind of conversation. And I'm just reminding myself to be somewhat gentle on myself because I am coming off this every day. And that's my main objective right now, because if I can do that, if I can be off my medications, then that's huge. So that's the number one thing, and I'll probably spend another 2.5 months in California. So I'm over halfway now, for sure. So I'm just going to do self-dialogue even though I'm really out of the flow of it. So when I say map consciousness to myself, I'm talking about mania and psychosis. And that's how I created that acronym, mania and psychosis. But I would like to create other possible words to go with that acronym. And I created one: meaning, action, potential. So the nervous system gets fired up with meaning, and when nerves fire, it's based on something called action potential, which is something to do with the difference of charge between the outer and the inner membrane, and then the charge travels along the nerve based on that. But in map consciousness, it's an action potential of meaning, so the nerves aren't firing around me and the ego process, but around a different seeing meaning and making meaning and sharing meaning process. So meaning, action potential. So the nerves are fired up with meaning, and the meaning comes through the human nervous system. We actually are able to harvest the meaning by virtue of having the human body apparatus. So part of this self-dialogue process is not doing self-dialogue before I came to California. It was just a natural unfolding process that I did, and now I'm doing it to see if I can get back into that mind state. But also I have the sense that I just want to talk about these things that I write down and catch up in a way. So I'm trying to catch up. So it's not really, so it's possible it's not coming across in the same way, but it doesn't matter, because this is more like brainstorming than really picking out the bits that have the most meaning. In a way, if I ever do share any of this, and people in the mental health community or labeled people watch this, maybe certain ideas will catch on and certain other ones won't, and people might want to talk about certain things and other things no. So this is more creating a lot of different stuff and not really placing value on it according to what I think is valuable to share. If I write it down, I most likely share it, and it's the opposite of what a lot of so-called content creators do. They really craft it and they really hone it down, and this makes it kind of funny and interesting because there'll be so much of it that it'll be kind of random to see what happens instead of really some kind of intentional thing that I'm hoping for some kind of outcome. So I'm going to focus on coming off medication, self-dialogue, and rollerblading as well. And at some point when I get over this ice cream craving phase, then perhaps I will start eating somewhat healthy. And maybe even in these months away, eating healthy won't be my focus at all, and I'll go back home and I'll need to get into shape. And then I will share that process of losing quite a few pounds very quickly. I got a new program called G-Force Visualizer, and when I started watching the visualizer, because it goes with iTunes, I had this sense that whoever wrote the program code looks nothing like what this visualizer actually does. It's all these awesome visualizations going along with the music, but the actual coding for the program, if we read that and looked at that and had a book of that, it would be completely uninteresting to us. So there's this programming language run through a computer, creates this visualization. And in a way, it feels like this language that we're looking for, the fundamental whatever of the universe, is so different from what that creates. That language run through the human body creates this whole world because we change the shape of the planet as human beings. Yet we're looking for something that, if we found it, probably would be completely uninteresting and gibberish, and we're trying to find this beautiful, elegant thing. But without the actual apparatus, without, say, the human body or some kind of life, the language is useless, and it probably would just look like coding in a book. It would look like just like with the music on the visualizer, you get this really cool visualization to watch and enjoy, but the code alone, or without the music, without the life, it's just not that interesting. It's just a bunch of coding. And I really want to connect with people that share some of these meanings, or share in the meaning making process and unfolding meaning. One thing I'm learning about being here is that it's actually a little bit difficult to exist for a long period of time among people who don't share the context of having some sort of mental health crisis, because I find that there's a much higher chance to talk to people that just speak the same language. And before some kind of crisis, oftentimes we have a meaning, and often in map consciousness, or so-called mania, we connect with a meaning more state. So we're making more meanings, we're seeing more meanings, and a lot of them. And I feel if more of us were connected to more meanings and making more meanings, we wouldn't need people going into crises to more of this meaning more. Or if life was more meaning more, we say meaningful, but I like meaning more. And when our senses are all activated, we begin enough to create laughter. So when I go home, I might want to focus on laughter and health. When I was watching a talk a couple weeks ago, there was a group of people, and somebody said on their slide, something, 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 and I will give an example of this in 5 minutes. And just the way they said that, everybody laughed. Everybody got it. Yet it wasn't even funny, but it was, and it was so subtle, but most people laughed. And that fascinates me, because everybody has to get this thing at the same time. And it's funny how that many people found it funny. I don't know, it's bizarre. And I used to do a lot involving laughter, and I've barely done any in this self-dialogue, which is kind of crazy. And I'm hoping that I'll get some of the serious stuff out of my system and move on to something different. This could just be the very beginning. And map consciousness is energy that's like a lubricant. It lubricates gestures. It loosens us up. It lubricates the stale, constricted ego and gives us access to more degrees of freedom. So in a way, a personal crisis is like ego lubricant. And I wonder if some of these memes might help to set some of my friends free to at least begin to make meaning again for oneself. And seeing that making meaning for oneself has nothing to do with right and wrong. And I probably talked about how MAP unlocks hidden potential, but then it seems to at some point retreat. And I wonder what will allow that MAP consciousness to unfold without retreating. And I think the answer is love. Because love has to hold and behold the somewhat craziness for a while. And I wrote down that the environment is the agent outside the brain that causes these phenomena. And I don't know what I was referring to, but I think I was referring to how somebody was talking about out-of-body experiences where people will actually be out of their body and looking at their body from in front of them or beside them. And they're trying to artificially recreate this by probing people's brains in laboratories, and I think they have done it. And so they're saying, well, if you can poke the brain and it happens, it's just a phenomena of the brain. But then I wrote down the environment causes these phenomena in a way. Some people have this out-of-body experience when, say, they're in a car accident or something. So it might be a folded up potential in the brain, but it unfolds when necessary. If somebody needs to view their body from outside the body in some kind of experience where the body's experiencing really extreme trauma in a car accident, well, then that's when it happens. That's when the brain unfolds to create that possibility. So just because one can poke a brain and that happens, probably every potential thing is folded up in the brain, and if you find the right place to poke, it'll happen. But the universe can poke us too. It can be the thing that causes that phenomena to unfold. And everything is folded up in the brain, and just because we can poke it doesn't mean that there's not a congruent actuality and reality where those things happen. Just because it is in the brain doesn't mean that that's what causes it or that's what it's used for. And that energy of MAP consciousness moved me into a different reality. So it's one thing to be outside the body looking at oneself, but it's another to be in the body but in a different reality, overlapping with the one that everyone shares. So there's so many different things that the brain can create, and reality with the brain acting together. I was thinking about thought and how I feel like thought circulates in our brain because we're not learning. So when we're seeing and learning, we're not thinking about, but we're in direct contact. So when we're not learning, it's almost like the brain is dead in a way. And when it's dead, the thoughts sort of swirl around the dead tissue, kind of like how ants will swarm around a dead insect on the ground. It's because it's dead. If it was alive, the ants wouldn't swarm around. So I feel like thought feeds on dead or inactive brain tissue, or it's a phenomena that arises when the brain isn't moving continuously with the present moment. It's as if we move through the universe and the brain moves as we move through the universe instead of moving in opposition, which means the brain's not moving pliably with the moment. And then thoughts start because the brain isn't with the moment. And when there are thoughts, the brain isn't with the moment. So it's sort of a reciprocal relationship. And so the brain isn't really living And thought isn't a living thing, so it's an appearance of living. So when we're caught in thoughts, we appear to be living, but our brain isn't really living. So we look like we're living, and we are living in a sense, but the brain isn't living. Our bodies are going through reality much like animals would, but so it's interesting. I feel like there's a new evolutionary phenomena. Instead of natural selection, it's called manic selection. So a manic brain would select for different meanings than the ones that have been brought into predominance in society. And if enough manic brains can move into that as a reality, then that would shift reality as manic selection. I feel like manic eyes change natural selection because manic eyes perceive differently and select for different meanings and things. And when we're in that mode of perception, we actually get to the edge of reality, the edge of perceptible reality, because we see a reality based on our conditioning and the stories that we're told. So if we go to a place where we're seeing different stories of how things could work, we eventually bump up against the end of the world in a way. And we often feel like it is a doomsday place, but really it could actually kind of be the end of the world in terms of the story. We get to the end of the story in the trajectory of the consensus world, and it conflicts with the meanings that we're able to see and make with manic perception and manic eyes. And so it feels like we're at the end of the world, but really we could be at also the beginning of this other world, which has different meanings, which could actually just be a co-creative world, realizing that we're creating the world with how we perceive and act, and moving forward with the right meanings, which we have to continue to perceive moment to moment by really being in contact with this living thing that we are. And I feel that's part of thought, is the brain is not in contact with itself. And the other morning I was sleeping in and I could feel and see my brain trying to work things out. It's sort of like when you can work on a problem subconsciously, but usually we're not aware. But sometimes we can be aware if we're half asleep or half dreaming or whatever. And I had the sense that it's not that I'm trying to figure stuff out, as in this me, but the human brain is trying to figure something out. The human brain, and we all have the same human brain. Drop the conditioning, drop the memories, we have the same human brain, and it's trying to figure stuff out. But we have all this conditioning and memories over top of it, which is messing up its processing of life. And I could just really see that the brain, I was there sort of aware, but I wasn't doing it. The brain was trying to figure something out, or wonder about something, or calculate something, and it was really interesting to watch and realize that this has nothing to do with me. And I feel like we have gotten to the edge of reality. I feel like when we connect with those new meanings, or the meaning-making process itself, and we see all these old meanings as meaningless, it really feels scary because we're so invested in it, and it feels like death to let go of that. And I think it's hard for most of us to let go. And somebody mentioned the work of Daniel Dennett, and I think he talks about memes. And he said that language undergoes natural selection. I think his work probably relates to this process somehow, but I haven't read it. It's impossible to read everybody's work. But I feel like the language of us manics is being suppressed by the unnatural selection of the pathologizing process. So there's this unnatural selection of language because we go into this language making, language creating, playing with language, unfolding new meaning state, and we're told that it's a meaningless mental illness and to not really go into it or think about it, it's just symptoms. And so to me, there is this language trying to arise through us as human beings because we need new forms of communication if the world isn't going to go to hell. And so using the language not as me is being suppressed. And we need to learn how to communicate not as the me, because that's what happens when we go into that state. We don't really have a me as much. So it's difficult to navigate. So we need to create new language and meanings together that creates that herd immunity against psychiatry. And I feel like meaning can come through us and we don't need a me. The me is what blocks meaning. So there's no need for a self. So in a way, the self-dialogue is actually selfless dialogue or no self-dialogue, because if I'm only thinking in terms of the me, I wouldn't be able to say 98% of this stuff, because that's probably the proportion that isn't directly related to a me. And I think that's part of the reason why I find it difficult to converse, is that most conversations are based on me, and it's sometimes difficult to talk that way. If I was to talk about my me, I would probably talk about coming off medications and things like that. And it's not a conversation I want to have with people right now.